The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. I was sick, sick unto death, with that long agony. And when they at length unbound me, and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitorial voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of revolution, perhaps from its association in fancy with the burr of a mill wheel. This only for a brief period, for presently I heard no more. Yet for a while I saw, but with how terrible an exaggeration, I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me whiter than the sheet upon which I traced these words, and thin, even to grotesqueness, thin with the intensity of their expression of firmness, of immovable resolution, of stern contempt, of human torture. I saw that the decrees of what to me was fate were still issuing from those lips. I saw them writhe with a deadly locution. I saw them fashion the syllables of my name, and I shuddered because no sound succeeded. I saw, too, for a few moments of delirious horror, the soft and nearly imperceptible waving of the sable draperies which enwrapped the walls of the apartment, and then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first they wore the aspect of charity, and seemed white, slender angels who would save me. But then, all at once, there came a most deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fibre in my frame thrill as if I had touched the wire of a galvanic battery, while the angel forms became meaningless spectres with heads of flame, and I saw that from them there would be no help. And then there stole into my fancy, like a rich musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently and stealthily, and it seemed long before it attained full appreciation. But just as my spirit came at length properly to feel and entertain it, the figures of the judges vanished as if magically from before me. The tall candles sank into nothingness, their flames went out utterly, the blackness of darkness supervened. All sensations appeared swallowed up in a mad rushing descent, as of the soul into Hades. Then silence and stillness and night were the universe. I had swooned, but still will not say that all of consciousness was lost. What of it there remained I will not attempt to define or even to describe. Yet all was not lost. In the deepest slumber, no. In delirium, no. In a swoon, no. In death, no. Even in the grave, all is not lost. Else there is no immortality for man. Arousing from the most profound of slumbers, we break the gossamer web of some dream. Yet in a second afterward, so frail may that web have been, we remembered not that we have dreamed in the return to life from the swoon. There are 2 stages. First, that of the sense of mental or spiritual. Secondly, that of the sense of physical existence. It seems probable that if, upon reaching the second stage, we could recall the impressions of the first, we should find these impressions eloquent in memories of the gulf beyond. And that gulf is what? How at least shall we distinguish its shadows from those of the tomb? But if the impressions of what I have termed the first stage are not at will recalled yet, after long interval, do they not come unbidden, while we marvel whence they come? He who has never swooned, is not he who finds strange palaces and wildly familiar faces in coals that glow, is not he who beholds floating in mid-air the sad visions that the many may not view, is not he who ponders over the perfume of some novel flower, is not he whose brain grows bewildered with the meaning of some musical cadence which has never before arrested his attention. Amid frequent and thoughtful endeavors to remember, amid earnest struggles to regather some token of the state of seeming nothingness into which my soul had lapsed, there have been moments when I have dreamed of success. There have been brief, very brief periods when I have conjured up remembrances which the lucid reason of a later epoch assures me could have had reference only to that condition of seeming unconsciousness. These shadows of memory tell indistinctly of tall figures that lifted and bore me in silence, down, down, still down, till a hideous dizziness oppressed me at the mere idea of the interminableness of the descent. They tell also of a vague horror at my heart, on account of that heart's unnatural stillness. Then comes a sense of sudden motionlessness throughout all things, as if those who bore me, a ghastly train, had outrun in their descent the limits of the limitless, and paused from the wearisomeness of their toil. After this I call to mind flatness and dampness, and then all is madness. The madness of a memory which busies itself among forbidden things. Very suddenly there came back to my soul motion and sound, the tumultuous motion of the heart, and in my ears the sound of its beating. Then a pause in which all is blank. Then again sound and motion and touch, a tingling sensation pervading my frame. Then the mere consciousness of existence without thought, a condition which lasted long, then very suddenly thought and shuddering terror, and earnest endeavor to comprehend my true state. Then a strong desire to lapse into insensibility. Then a rushing revival of soul, and a successful effort to move. And now a full memory of the trial, of the judges, of the sable draperies, of the sentence, of the sickness, of the swoon. Then entire forgetfulness of all that followed, of all that a later day and much earnestness of endeavor have enabled me vaguely to recall. So far I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back, unbound. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. There I suffered it to remain for many minutes, while I strove to imagine where and what I could be. I longed, yet dared not to employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance at objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon things horrible, but that I grew aghast lest there should be nothing to see. At length, with a wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts, then, were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I still lay quietly, and made effort to exercise my reason. I brought to mind the inquisitorial proceedings, and attempted from that point to deduce my real condition. The sentence had passed, and it appeared to me that a very long interval of time had since elapsed. Yet not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. Such a supposition, notwithstanding what we read in fiction, is altogether inconsistent with real existence. But where and in what state was I? The condemned to death, I knew, perished usually at the autos da fe, and one of these had been held on the very night of the day of my trial. Had I been remanded to my dungeon to await the next sacrifice, which would not take place for many months? This I at once saw could not be. Victims had been in immediate demand. Moreover, my dungeon, as well as all the condemned cells at Toledo, had stone floors, and light was not altogether excluded. A fearful idea now suddenly drove the blood in torrents upon my heart, and for a brief period I once more relapsed into insensibility. Upon recovering, I at once started to my feet, trembling convulsively in every fibre. I thrust my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move a step, lest I should be impeded by the walls of a tomb. Perspiration burst from every pore, and stood in cold, big beads upon my forehead. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable, and I cautiously moved forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in the hope of catching some faint ray of light. I proceeded for many paces, but still all was blackness and vacancy. I breathed more freely. It seemed evident that mine was not at least the most hideous of fates. And now, as I still continued to step cautiously onward, there came thronging upon my recollection 1,000 vague rumors of the horrors of Toledo. Of the dungeons there had been strange things narrated, fables. I had always deemed them, but yet strange and too ghastly to repeat, save in a whisper. Was I left to perish of starvation in this subterranean world of darkness, or what fate, perhaps even more fearful, awaited me? That the result would be death, and a death of more than customary bitterness, I knew too well the character of my judges to doubt. The mode and the hour were all that occupied or distracted me. My outstretched hands at length encountered some solid obstruction. It was a wall, seemingly of stone masonry, very smooth, slimy, and cold. I followed it up, stepping with all the careful distrust with which certain antique narratives had inspired me. This process, however, afforded me no means of ascertaining the dimensions of my dungeon, as I might make its circuit and return to the point whence I set out without being aware of the fact. So perfectly uniform seemed the wall. I therefore sought the knife which had been in my pocket when led into the inquisitorial chamber, but it was gone. My clothes had been exchanged for a wrapper of coarse serge. I had thought of forcing the blade in some minute crevice of the masonry, so as to identify my point of departure. The difficulty, nevertheless, was but trivial, although in the disorder of my fancy it seemed at first insuperable. I tore a part of the hem from the robe and placed the fragment at full length, and at right angles to the wall. In groping my way around the prison, I could not fail to encounter this rag upon completing the circuit. So at least I thought, but I had not counted upon the extent of the dungeon or upon my own weakness. The ground was moist and slippery. I staggered onward for some time. When I stumbled and fell, my excessive fatigue induced me to remain prostrate, and sleep soon overtook me as I lay. Upon wakening and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher with water. I was too much exhausted to reflect upon the circumstance, but ate and drank with avidity. Shortly afterwards I resumed my tour around the prison, and, with much toil, came at last upon the fragment of the serge. Up to the period when I fell, I had counted 52 paces, and upon resuming my walk I had counted 48 more. When arriving at the rag, there were in all, then, 100 paces, and admitting 2 paces to the yard, I presumed the dungeon to be 50 yards in circuit. I had met, however, with many angles in the wall, and thus I could form no guess at the shape of the vault. For vault I could not help supposing it to be. I had little object, certainly, no hope in these researches, but a vague curiosity prompted me to continue them. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the area of the enclosure. At first I proceeded with extreme caution, for the floor, although seemingly of solid material, was treacherous with slime. At length, however, I took courage, and did not hesitate to step firmly, endeavoring to cross in as direct a line as possible. I had advanced some 10 or 12 paces in this manner, when the remnant of the torn hem of my robe became entangled between my legs. I stepped on it and fell violently on my face. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend a somewhat startling circumstance, which yet in a few seconds afterward, and while I still lay prostrate, arrested my attention. It was this: my chin rested upon the floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head, although seemingly at a less elevation than the chin, touched nothing. At the same time my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm, and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining at the moment. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment, and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At length there was a sudden plunge into water, succeeded by loud echoes. At the same moment there came a sound resembling the quick opening and as rapid closing of a door overhead, while a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom, and as suddenly faded away. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world had seen me no more, and the death just avoided was of that very character which I had regarded as fabulous and frivolous in the tales respecting the Inquisition. To the victims of its tyranny, there was the choice of death, with its direst physical agonies, or death, with its most hideous moral horrors. I had been reserved for the latter. By long suffering my nerves had been unstrung, until I trembled at the sound of my own voice, and had become in every respect a fitting subject for the species of torture which awaited me. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than risk the terrors of the wells, of which my imagination now pictured many in various positions about the dungeon. In other conditions of mind, I might have had courage to end my misery at once, by a plunge into one of these abysses, but now I was the veriest of cowards. Neither could I forget what I had read of these pits, that the sudden extinction of life formed no part of their most horrible plan. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many long hours, but at length I again slumbered. Upon arousing I found by my side, as before, a loaf and a pitcher of water. A burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the vessel at a draught. It must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk before I became irresistibly drowsy. A deep sleep fell upon me, a sleep like that of death. How long it lasted, of course, I know not, but when once again I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible. By a wild sulphurous lustre, the origin of which I could not at first determine, I was enabled to see the extent and aspect of the prison. In its size I had been greatly mistaken. The whole circuit of its walls did not exceed 25 yards. For some minutes this fact occasioned me a world of vain trouble, vain indeed. For what could be of less importance, under the terrible circumstances which environed me, than the mere dimensions of my dungeon? But my soul took a wild interest in trifles, and I busied myself in endeavors to account for the error I had committed in my measurement. The truth at length flashed upon me. In my first attempt at exploration, I had counted 52 paces, up to the period when I fell. I must then have been within a pace or two of the fragment of serge. In fact, I had nearly performed the circuit of the vault. I then slept, and, upon awaking, I must have returned upon my steps, thus supposing the circuit nearly double what it actually was. My confusion of mind prevented me from observing that I began my tour with the wall to the left, and ended it with the wall to the right. I had been deceived, too, in respect to the shape of the enclosure. In feeling my way I had found many angles, and thus deduced an idea of great irregularity. So potent is the effect of total darkness upon one arousing from lethargy or sleep. The angles were simply those of a few slight depressions or niches at odd intervals. The general shape of the prison was square. What I had taken for masonry seemed now to be iron, or some other metal in huge plates, whose sutures or joints occasioned the depression. The entire surface of this metallic enclosure was rudely daubed in all the hideous and repulsive devices to which the charnel superstition of the monks has given rise. The figures of fiends and aspects of menace, with skeleton forms and other more really fearful images, overspread and disfigured the walls. I observed that the outline of these monstrosities were sufficiently distinct, but that the colors seemed faded and blurred, as if from the effects of a damp atmosphere. I now noticed the floor, too, which was of stone. In the center yawned the circular pit from whose jaws I had escaped, but it was the only one in the dungeon. All this I saw indistinctly, and by much effort, for my personal condition had been greatly changed during slumber. I now lay upon my back, and at full length, on a species of low framework of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap resembling a surcingle. It passed in many convulsions about my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head and my left arm to such an extent that I could, by a dint of much exertion, supply myself with food from an earthen dish which lay by my side on the floor. I saw to my horror that the pitcher had been removed. I say to my horror, for I was consumed with intolerable thirst. This thirst it appeared to be the design of my persecutors to stimulate, for the food in the dish was meat pungently seasoned. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead and constructed much as the side walls. In one of its panels a very singular figure riveted my whole attention. It was the painted figure of Time, as he is commonly represented, save that in lieu of a scythe. He held what, at a casual glance, I supposed to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. There was something, however, in the appearance of this machine which caused me to regard it more attentively. While I gazed directly upward at it, for its position was immediately over my own, I fancied that I saw it in motion. In an instant afterward, the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief and of course slow. I watched it for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. Wearied at length with observing its dull movement, I turned my eyes upon the other objects in the cell. A slight noise attracted my notice, and looking to the floor, I saw several enormous rats traversing it. They had issued from the well which lay just within view to my right. Even then, while I gazed, they came up in troops, hurriedly, with ravenous eyes, allured by the scent of the meat. From this it required much effort and attention to scare them away. It might have been half an hour, perhaps even an hour, for I could take but imperfect note of time, before I again cast my eyes upward. What I then saw confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent by nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, its velocity was also much greater. But what mainly disturbed me was the idea that it had perceptibly descended. I now observed with what horror it is needless to say, that its nether extremity was formed of a crescent of glistening steel, about a foot in length from horn to horn, the horns upward, and the horn's under edge evidently as keen as that of a razor. Like a razor also, it seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid and broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass, and the whole hissed as it swung through the air. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me by monkish ingenuity in torture. My cognizance of the pit had become known to the inquisitorial agents, the pit whose horrors had been destined for so bold a recusant as myself, the pit typically of hell and regarded by rumor as the ultima thule of all their punishments. The plunge into this pit I had avoided by the merest of accidents, and I knew that surprise or entrapment into torment formed an important portion of all the grotesquerie of these dungeon deaths. Having failed to fall, it was no part of the demon plan to hurl me into the abyss, and thus, there being no alternative, a different and milder destruction awaited me. Milder! I half smiled in my agony as I thought of such application of such a term. What boots it to tell of the long, long hours of horror, more than mortal, during which I counted the rushing oscillations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, with a descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages down, and still down it came. Days passed, it might have been that many days passed, ere it swept so closely over me as to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. I grew frantically mad, and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful scimitar. And then I fell suddenly calm, and lay smiling at the glittering death, as a child at some rare bauble. There was another interval of utter insensibility. It was brief, for upon again lapsing into life there had been no perceptible descent in the pendulum. But it might have been long, for I knew there were demons who took note of my swoon, and who could have arrested the vibration at pleasure. Upon my recovery, too, I felt very inexpressibly sick and weak, as if through long inanition. Even amid the agonies of that period, the human nature craved food. With painful effort I outstretched my left arm as far as my bonds permitted, and took possession of the small remnant which had been spared me by the rats. As I put a portion of it within my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. Yet what business had I with hope? It was, as I say, a half-formed thought. Man has many such which are never completed. I felt that it was of joy, of hope, but I felt also that it had perished in its formation. In vain I struggled to perfect, to regain it. Long suffering had nearly annihilated all my ordinary powers of mind. I was an imbecile, an idiot. The vibration of the pendulum was at right angles to my length. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of the heart. It would fray the serge of my robe. It would return and repeat its operations again and again, notwithstanding its terrifically wide sweep, some 30 feet or more, and the hissing vigor of its descent sufficient to sunder these very walls of iron. Still the fraying of my robe would be all that, for several minutes, it would accomplish. And at this thought I paused. I dared not to go further than this reflection. I dwelt upon it with a pertinacity of attention, as if in so dwelling I could arrest here the descent of the steel. I forced myself to ponder upon the sound of the crescent as it should pass across the garment, upon the peculiar thrilling sensation which the friction of cloth produces on the nerves. I pondered upon all this frivolity until my teeth were on edge. Down steadily, down it crept. I took a frenzied pleasure in contrasting its downward with its lateral velocity, to the right, to the left, far and wide, with the shriek of a damned spirit, to my heart with the stealthy pace of the tiger. I alternately laughed and howled as the one or the other idea grew predominant. Down, certainly, relentlessly down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. I struggled violently, furiously, to free my left arm. This was free only from the elbow to the hand. I could reach the latter from the platter beside me to my mouth with great effort, but no farther. Could I have broken the fastenings above the elbow, I would have seized and attempted to arrest the pendulum. I might as well have attempted to arrest an avalanche. Down still, unceasingly still, inevitably down, I gasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrunk convulsively at its every sweep. My eyes followed its outward or upward whirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. They closed themselves spasmodically at the descent, although death would have been a relief. Oh, how unspeakable! Still I quivered in every nerve to think how slight a sinking of the machinery would precipitate that keen, glistening axe upon my bosom. It was hope that prompted the nerve to quiver, the frame to shrink. It was hope, the hope that triumphs on the rack, that whispers to the death condemned, even in the dungeons of the Inquisition. I saw that some 10 or 12 vibrations would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe, and with this observation there suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. For the first time during many hours, or perhaps days, I thought, it now occurred to me, that the bandage or syringical which enveloped me was unique. I was tied by no separate cord. The first stroke of the razor-like crescent athwart any portion of the band would so detach it that it might be unwound from my person by means of my left hand. But how fearful, in that case, the proximity of the steel, the result of the slightest struggle, how deadly. Was it likely, moreover, that the minions of the torturer had not foreseen and provided for this possibility? Was it probable that the bandage crossed my bosom in the track of the pendulum? Dreading to find my faint and, as it seemed, my last hope frustrated, I so far elevated my head as to obtain a distinct view of my breast. The syringical enveloped my limbs and body close in all directions, save in the path of the destroying crescent. Scarcely had I dropped my head back into its original position, when there flashed upon my mind what I cannot better describe than as the unformed half of that idea of deliverance to which I have previously alluded, and of which a moiety only floated indeterminately through my brain. When I raised food to my burning lips, the whole thought was now present, feeble, scarcely sane, scarcely definite, but still entire. I proceeded at once, with the nervous energy of despair, to attempt its execution. For many hours the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited for motionlessness on my part to make me their prey. To what food, I thought, have they been accustomed in the well? They had devoured in spite of all my efforts to prevent them, all but a small remnant of the contents of the dish. I had fallen into an habitual seesaw or wave of the hand about the platter, and at length the unconscious uniformity of the movement deprived it of effect. In their ferocity, the vermin frequently fastened their sharp fangs in my fingers, with the particles of the oily and spicy viand which now remained. I thoroughly rubbed the bandage wherever I could reach it. Then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified at the change, at the cessation of movement. They shrank, alarmed, back. Many sought the well, but this was only for a moment. I had not counted in vain upon their ferocity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at the surcingle. This seemed the signal for a general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, they overran it, and leaped in hundreds upon my person. The measured movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves with the anointed bandage. They pressed, they swarmed upon me in ever-accumulating heaps. They writhed upon my throat, their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust, for which the world has no name, swelled my bosom, and chilled, with a heavy clamminess, my heart. Yet 1 minute, and I felt that the struggle would be over. Plainly I perceived the loosening of the bandage. I knew that in more than one place it must be already severed. With a more than human resolution I lay still. Nor had I erred in my calculations, nor had I endured in vain. I at length felt that I was free. The surcingle hung in ribbons from my body, but the stroke of the pendulum already pressed upon my bosom. It had divided the serge of the rope, it had cut through the linen beneath. Twice again it swung, and a sharp sense of pain shot through every nerve. But moments of escape had arrived. At a wave of my hand, my deliverers hurried tumultuously away. With a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow, I slid from the embrace of the bandage and beyond the reach of the scimitar. For the moment, at least, I was free. Free and in the grasp of the Inquisition. I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor of the prison, when the motion of the hellish machine ceased, and I beheld it drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. This was a lesson which I took desperately to heart. My every motion was undoubtedly watched. Free, I had but escaped death in one form of agony, to be delivered on to worse than death in some other. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around the barriers of iron that hemmed me in. Something unusual, some change which at first I could not appreciate distinctly. It was obvious, had taken place in the apartment for many minutes of a dreamy and trembling abstraction. I busied myself in vain, unconnected conjuncture. During this period, I became aware for the first time of the origin of the sulphurous light which illumined the cell. It proceeded from a fissure, about half an inch in width, extending entirely around the prison at the base of the walls, which thus appeared and were completely separated from the floor. I endeavored, but of course in vain, to look through the aperture. As I arose from the attempt, the mystery of the alteration in the chamber broke at once upon my understanding. I have observed that although the outlines of the figures upon the walls were sufficiently distant, yet the colors seemed blurred and indefinite. These colors had now assumed, and were momentarily assuming, a startling and most intense brilliancy that gave to the spectral and fiendish portraitures an aspect that might have thrilled even firmer nerves than my own. Demon eyes of a wild and ghastly vivacity glared upon me in 1,000 directions where none had been visible before, and gleamed with the lurid luster of a fire that I could not force my imagination to regard as unreal. Unreal, even while I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of the vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in the eyes that glared at my agonies. A richer tint of crimson diffused itself over the pictured horrors of blood. I panted, I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt of the design of my tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting, oh, most demonic of men. I shrank from the glowing metal to the center of the cell. Amid the thought of the fiery destruction that impeded the idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like balm. I rushed to its deadly brink. I threw my straining vision below. The glare from the enkindled roof illumined its inmost recesses. Yet for a wild moment did my spirit refuse to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length it wrestled its way into my soul. It bummed itself in upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for a voice to speak! Oh, horror, oh! Any horror but this! With a shriek I rushed from the margin and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat rapidly increased, and once again I looked up shuddering, as with a fit of the ague. There had been a second change in the cell, and now the change was obviously in the form. As before, it was in vain that I at first endeavored to appreciate or understand what was taking place. But not long was I left in doubt. The inquisitorial vengeance had been hurried by my twofold escape, and there was to be no more dallying with the king of terrors. The room had been square. I saw that 2 of its iron angles were now acute, 2 consequently obtuse. The fearful difference quickly increased with a low rumbling or moaning sound. In an instant the apartment had shifted its form into that of a lozenge, but the alteration stopped not here. I neither hoped nor desired it to stop. I could have clasped the red walls to my bosom as a garment of eternal peace. Death, I said, any death but that of the pit. Fool, might I not have known that into the pit it was the object of the burning iron to urge me? Could I resist its glow? Or if even that, could I withstand its pressure? And now flatter and flatter grew the lozenge, with a rapidity that left me no time for contemplation. Its center, and of course its greatest width, came just over the yawning gulf. I shrank back, but the closing walls pressed me relentlessly onward. At a length for my seared and withering body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered upon the brink. I averted my eyes. There was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell, fainting into the abyss. It was that of General Lasalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. End of The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. Recording by Sarah Jabir.
The Story of the Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Lord. The Story of the Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells. The scene amidst which Clayton told his last story comes back very vividly to my mind. There he sat, for the greater part of the time, in the corner of the authentic settle by the spacious open fire, and Sanderson sat beside him smoking the Broseley clay that bore his name. And there was Evans, and that marvel among actors, Wish, who was also a modest man. We had all come down to the Mermaid Club that Saturday morning, except Clayton, who had slept there overnight, which indeed gave him the opening of his story. And we had golfed until golfing was invisible. And we had dined, and we were in that mood of tranquil kindliness when men will suffer a story. When Clayton began to tell one, We naturally supposed he was lying. It may be that, indeed, he was lying. Of that the reader will speedily be able to judge as well as I. He began, it is true, with an air of matter-of-fact anecdote, but that, we thought, was only the incurable artifice of the man. "I say," he remarked, after a long consideration of the upward rain of sparks from the log that Sanderson had thumped, "you know, I was alone here last night." "Except for the domestics," said Wish. "Who sleep in the other wing," said Clayton. "Yes, well—" He pulled at his cigar for some little time, as though he still hesitated about his confidence. Then he said quite quietly, "I caught a ghost." "Caught a ghost, did you?" said Sanderson. "Where is it?" And Evans, who admires Clayton immensely and has been 4 weeks in America, shouted, "Caught a ghost, did you, Clayton? I'm glad of it. Tell us all about it right now." Clayton said he would in a minute and asked him to shut the door. He looked apologetically at me. "There's no eavesdropping, of course, but we don't want to upset our very excellent service with any rumours of ghosts in the place. There's too much shadow and oak panelling to trifle with that. And this, you know, wasn't a regular ghost. I don't think it will come again, ever." "You mean to say you didn't keep it?" said Sanderson. "I hadn't the heart to," said Clayton. And Sanderson said he was surprised. We laughed, and Clayton looked aggrieved. "I know," he said, with a flicker of a smile. "But the fact is, it really was a ghost, and I'm as sure of it as I am that I'm talking to you now. I'm not joking. I mean what I say." Sanderson drew deeply at his pipe, with one reddish eye on Clayton, and then emitted a thin jet of smoke, more eloquent than many words. Clayton ignored the comment. "It is the strangest thing that has ever happened in my life. You know, I never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort before, ever. And then, you know, I bag one in a corner, and the whole business is in my hands." He meditated still more profoundly, and produced and began to pierce a second cigar with a curious little stabber he affected. "You talked to it?" asked Wish. "For the space, probably, of an hour." "Chatty," I said, joining the party of sceptics. "The poor devil was in trouble," said Clayton, bowed over his cigar end, and with the very faintest note of reproof. "Sobbing?" someone asked. Clayton heaved a realistic sigh at the memory. "Good Lord," he said. "Yes." And then, "Poor fellow, yes." "Where did you strike it?" asked Evans, in his best American accent. "I never realized," said Clayton, ignoring him. "The poor sort of thing a ghost might be." And he hung us up again for a time, while he sought for matches in his pocket, and lit and warmed to his cigar. "I took an advantage," he reflected at last. We were none of us in a hurry. "A character," he said, "remains just the same character for all that it's been disembodied. That's a thing we too often forget. People with a certain strength or fixity of purpose may have ghosts of a certain strength and fixity of purpose. Most haunting ghosts, you know, must be as one-idead as monomaniacs, and as obstinate as mules, to come back again and again. This poor creature wasn't." He suddenly looked up, rather queerly, and his eye went round the room. "I say it," he said, "in all kindliness, but that is the plain truth of the case.
Even at the first glance, he struck me as weak.
He punctuated with the help of his cigar.
I came upon him, in the long passage. His back was towards me, and I saw him first. Right off, I knew him for a ghost. He was transparent and whitish, clean through his chest. I could see the glimmer of the little window at the end, and not only his physique, but his attitude struck me as being weak. He looked, as though he didn't know in the slightest whatever he meant to do. One hand was on the panelling, and the other fluttered to his mouth, like so.
What sort of physique? Said Sanderson.
Lean, that sort of young man's neck that has two great flutings down the back, here and here, so. And a little meanish head with scrubby hair, and rather bad ears. Shoulders bad, narrower than the hips. Turn-down collar, ready-made short jacket, trousers baggy, and a little frayed at the heels. That's how he took me. I came very quietly up the staircase. I did not carry a light, the candles are on the landing table, and there is that lamp, and I was in my list slippers, and I saw him as I came up. I stopped dead at that, taking him in. I wasn't a bit afraid. I think that in most of these affairs, one is never nearly so afraid nor excited as one imagines one would be. I was surprised and interested. I thought, good Lord, he is a ghost at last. And I haven't believed for a moment in ghosts during the last 25 years.
Said Wish.
I suppose I wasn't on the landing a moment before he found out I was there. He turned on me sharply, and I saw the face of an immature young man. A weak nose, a scrubby little moustache, a feeble chin. So for an instant we stood, he looking over his shoulder at me, and regarded one another. Then he seemed to remember his high calling. He turned round, drew himself up, projected his face, raised his arms, spread his hands in approved ghost fashion, came towards me. As he did so, his little jaw dropped, and he emitted a faint, drawn-out boo. No, it wasn't. Not a bit dreadful. I'd dined. I'd had a bottle of champagne, and being all alone, perhaps 2 or 3, perhaps even 4 or 5 whiskies. So I was as solid as rocks, and no more frightened than if I'd been assailed by a frog. Boo, I said. Nonsense. You don't belong to this place. What are you doing here? I could see him wince. Boo, he said. Boo be hanged. Are you a member? I said, and just to show I didn't care a pin for him, I stepped through a corner of him and made to light my candle. Are you a member? I repeated, looking at him sideways. He moved a little, so as to stand clear of me, and his bearing became crestfallen. No, he said, in answer to the persistent interrogation of my eye. I'm not a member. I'm a ghost. Well, that doesn't give you the run of the Mermaid Club. Is there anyone you want to see, or anything of that sort? And doing it as steadily as possible, for fear that he should mistake the carelessness of whisky for the distraction of fear, I got my candle alight. I turned on him, holding it. What are you doing here? I said. He had dropped his hands and stopped his booing, and there he stood, abashed and awkward, the ghost of a weak, Silly, aimless young man. I'm haunting, he said. You haven't any business to, I said, in a quiet voice. I'm a ghost, he said, as if in defence. That may be, but you haven't any business to haunt here. This is a respectable private club. People often stop here with nursemaids and children and going about in the careless way you do. Some poor little mite could easily come upon you and be scared out of her wits. I suppose you didn't think of that. No, sir, he said, I didn't. You should have done. You haven't any claim on the place, have you? Weren't murdered here or anything of that sort? None, sir. But I thought, as it was old and oak-panelled, that's no excuse. I regarded him firmly. Your coming here is a mistake, I said, in a tone of friendly superiority. I feigned, to see if I had my matches, and then looked up at him frankly. If I were you, I wouldn't wait for cockcrow. I'd vanish right away. He looked embarrassed. The fact is, sir, he began. I'd vanish, I said, driving it home. The fact is, sir, that somehow I can't. You can't? No, sir. There's something I've forgotten. I've been hanging about here since midnight last night, hiding in the cupboards of the empty bedrooms and things like that. I'm flurried. I've never come haunting before, and it seems to put me out. Put you out? Yes, sir. I've tried to do it several times, and it doesn't come off. There's some little thing has slipped me, and I can't get back. That, rather bowled me over. He looked at me in such an abject way that, for the life of me, I couldn't keep up quite the high, hectoring vein I had adopted. That's queer, I said, and as I spoke, I fancied I heard someone moving about down below. Come into my room and tell me more about it, I said. I didn't, of course, understand this, and I tried to take him by the arm. But, of course, you might as well have tried to take hold of a puff of smoke. I'd forgotten my number, I think. Anyhow, I remember going into several bedrooms. It was lucky. I was the only soul in that wing, until I saw my traps. Here we are, I said, and sat down in the armchair. Sit down and tell me all about it. Seems to me you've got yourself into a jolly awkward position, old chap. Well, he said, he wouldn't sit down. He'd prefer to flit up and down the room, if it was all the same to me. And so he did. And in a little while we were deep in a long and serious talk. And presently, something of those whiskies and sodas evaporated out of me, and I began to realize just a little what a thundering, rum and weird business it was that I was in. There he was, semi-transparent, the proper conventional phantom, and noiseless, except for his ghost of a voice, flitting to and fro in that nice, clean, chintz-hung old bedroom. You could see the gleam of the copper candlesticks through him, and the lights on the brass fender, and the corners of the framed engravings on the wall. And there he was, telling me all about this wretched little life of his that had recently ended on earth. He hadn't a particularly honest face, but being transparent, of course, he couldn't avoid telling the truth. Eh? Said Wish, suddenly sitting up in his chair. What? Said Clayton. Being transparent. Couldn't avoid telling the truth. I don't see it, said Wish. I don't see it, said Clayton, with inimitable assurance. But it is so, I can assure you, nevertheless. I don't believe he got once a nail's breadth off the Bible truth. He told me how he'd been killed. He went down into a London basement with a candle to look for a leakage of gas, and described himself as a senior English master in a London private school when that release occurred.
Poor wretch, said I.
That's what I thought, and the more he talked, the more I thought it. There he was, purposeless in life, and purposeless out of it. He talked of his father and mother and his schoolmaster, and all who had ever been anything to him in the world, meanly. He'd been too sensitive, too nervous. None of them had ever valued him properly or understood him, he said. He had never had a real friend in the world, I think. He had never had a success. He had shirked games and failed examinations. It's like that with some people, he said. Whenever I got into the examination room or anywhere, everything seemed to go. Engaged to be married, of course, to another oversensitive person, I suppose, when the indiscretion with the gas escape ended his affairs. And where are you now? I asked. Not in... He wasn't clear on that point at all. The impression he gave me was of a sort of vague, intermediate state, a special reserve for souls too non-existent for anything so positive as either sin nor virtue. I don't know. He was much too egotistical and unobservant to give me any clear idea of the kind of place, kind of country there is on the other side of things. Wherever he was, he seems to have fallen in with a set of kindred spirits, ghosts of weak, cockney young men who were on a footing of Christian names. And among these, there was certainly a lot of talk about going haunting and things like that. Yes, going haunting. They seem to think haunting a tremendous adventure, and most of them funked it all the time. And so primed, he had come.
But really, said Wish to the fire,
these are the impressions he gave me, anyhow,
said Clayton, modestly.
I may, of course, have been in a rather uncritical state, but that was the sort of background he gave to himself. He kept flitting up and down, with his thin voice talking about his wretched self, and never a word of clear, firm statement, from first to last. He was thinner and sillier and more pointless than if he had been real and alive. Only then, he would not have been in my bedroom here. If he had been alive, I should have kicked him out.
Of course, said Evans. There are poor mortals like that, and there's just as much chance of their having ghosts as the rest of us, I admitted.
What gave a sort of point to him, was the fact that he did not seem within limits to have found himself out. The mess he had made of haunting had depressed him terribly. He'd been told it would be a lark. He had come expecting it to be a lark. And here it was. Nothing but another failure added to his record. He proclaimed himself an utter, out-and-out failure. He said, and I can quite believe it, that he had never tried to do anything all his life that he hadn't made a perfect mess of, and through all the wastes of eternity he never would. If he had had sympathy, perhaps. He paused at that and stood regarding me. He remarked that, strange as it might seem to me, nobody, not anyone, ever had given him the amount of sympathy I was doing now. I could see what he wanted straight away, and I determined to head him off at once. I may be a brute, but being the only real friend, the recipient of the confidences of one of these egotistical weaklings, ghost or body, is beyond my physical endurance. I got up briskly. "Don't you brood on these things too much," I said. "The thing you've got to do is to get out of this sharp. You pull yourself together and try." "I can't," he said. "You try," I said, and try he did.
"Try," said Sanderson. "How?"
"Passes,"
said Clayton. "Passes?"
"Complicated series of gestures and passes with the hands. That's how he had come in, and that's how he had to get out again. Lord, what a business I had!"
"But how could any series of passes—" I began.
"My dear man," said Clayton,
turning on me and putting a great emphasis on certain words,
"you want everything clear. I don't know how. All I know is that you do. That he did. Anyhow, at least, after a fearful time, he got his passes right, and suddenly disappeared."
"Did you," said Sanderson slowly, "observe the passes?"
"Yes,"
said Clayton, and seemed to think.
"It was tremendously queer," he said. "There we were, I and this thin, vague ghost, in that silent room, in this silent, empty inn, in this silent little Friday night town. Not a sound, except our voices, and a faint panting he made when he swung. There was the bedroom candle, and one candle on the dressing table alight. That was all. Sometimes one or other would flare up into a tall, lean, astonished flame for a space. And queer things happened. 'I can't,' he said. 'I shall never.' And suddenly he sat down on a little chair at the foot of the bed and began to sob and sob. Lord, what a harrowing, whimpering thing he seemed. 'You pull yourself together,' I said, and tried to pat him on the back, and my confounded hand went through him. By that time, I wasn't nearly so massive as I had been on the landing. I got the queerness of it full. I remember snatching back my hand out of him, as it were, with a little thrill, and walking over to the dressing table. 'You pull yourself together,' I said to him, 'and try.' And in order to encourage and help him, I began to try as well."
"What?" said Sanderson. "The passes?"
"Yes, the passes."
"But," I said, moved by an idea that eluded me for a space. "This is interesting," said Sanderson, with his finger in his pipe bowl. "You mean to say this ghost of yours gave away—"
"Did his level best to give away the whole confounded barrier? Yes."
"He didn't," said Wish. "He couldn't, or you'd have gone there too." "That's precisely it," I said, finding my elusive idea put into words for me.
"That is precisely it,"
said Clayton, with thoughtful eyes upon the fire. For just a little while there was silence. "And at last he did it," said Sanderson.
"At last he did it. I had to keep him up to it hard, but he did it at last, rather suddenly. He despaired. We had a scene, and then he got up abruptly and asked me to go through the whole performance, slowly, so that he might see. I believe, he said, if I could see, I should spot what was wrong at once. And he did. 'I know,' he said. 'What do you know?' said I. I know, he repeated. Then he said, peevishly, I can't do it if you look at me. I really can't. It's been that, partly all along. I'm such a nervous fellow that you put me out. Well, we had a bit of an argument. Naturally, I wanted to see, but he was as obstinate as a mule, and suddenly I had come over as tired as a dog. He tired me out. All right, I said. I won't look at you, and turned towards the mirror on the wardrobe by the bed. He started off very fast. I tried to follow him by looking in the looking-glass to see just what it was had hung. Round went his arms and his hands, so, and so, and so. And then, with a rush, came to the last gesture of all. You stand erect and open out your arms. And so, don't you know, he stood. And then he didn't. He didn't. He wasn't. I wheeled round from the looking-glass to him. There was nothing. I was alone, with the flaring candles and a staggering mind. What had happened? Had anything happened? Had I been dreaming? And then, with an absurd note of finality about it, the clock upon the landing discovered the moment was ripe for striking one. So, ping! And I was as grave and sober as a judge, with all my champagne and whisky gone into the vast serene, feeling queer, confoundedly queer. Queer, good Lord.
He regarded his cigar ash for a moment.
That's all that happened, he said.
And then you went to bed? Asked Evans.
What else was there to do?
I looked Wish in the eye. We wanted to scoff. And there was something perhaps in Clayton's voice and manner that hampered our desire. And about these passes, said Sanderson.
I believe I could do them now.
Oh, said Sanderson, and produced a penknife and set himself to grub the dottle out of the bowl of his clay. Why don't you do them now? Said Sanderson, shutting his penknife with a click.
That's what I'm going to do, said Clayton.
They won't work, said Evans. If they do, I suggested. I'd rather you didn't, said Wish, stretching out his legs. Why? Asked Evans. I'd rather he didn't, said Wish. But he hasn't got 'em right, said Sanderson, plugging too much tobacco in his pipe. All the same, I'd rather he didn't, said Wish. We argued with Wish. He said that for Clayton to go through those gestures was like mocking a serious matter. But you don't believe? I said. Wish glanced at Clayton, who was staring into the fire, weighing something in his mind. I do. More than half, anyhow, I do, said Wish. Clayton, said I, you're too good a liar for us. Most of it was all right, but that disappearance happened to be convincing. Tell us it's a tale of cock and bull. He stood up, without heeding me, took the middle of the hearthrug, and faced me. For a moment he regarded his feet thoughtfully, and then for all the rest of the time his eyes were on the opposite wall, with an intent expression. He raised his two hands slowly to the level of his eyes, and so began. Now, Sanderson is a Freemason, a member of the Lodge of the Four Kings, which devotes itself so ably to the study and elucidation of all the mysteries of Masonry, past and present. And among the students of this lodge, Sanderson is by no means the least. He followed Clayton's motions with a singular interest in his reddish eye. That's not bad,
he said, when it was done. "You really do, put things together, Clayton, in a most amazing fashion. But there's one little detail out." "I know," said Clayton. "I believe I could tell you which." "Well?" "This," said Clayton, and did a queer little twist and writhing and thrust of the hands. "Yes, that, was what he couldn't get right," said Clayton. "But how do you—" "Most of this business, and particularly how you invented it, I don't understand at all," said Sanderson. "But just that phase, I do." He reflected. "These happen to be a series of gestures connected with a certain branch of esoteric masonry. Probably you know, or else how?" He reflected still further. "I do not see I can do any harm in telling you just the proper twist. After all, if you know, you know. If you don't, you don't." "I know nothing," said Clayton, "except what the poor devil let out last night." "Well, anyhow," said Sanderson, and placed his churchwarden very carefully upon the shelf over the fireplace. Then, very rapidly, he gesticulated with his hands. "So?" said Clayton, repeating. "So," said Sanderson, and took his pipe in hand again. "Ah, now," said Clayton, "I can do the whole thing right." He stood up before the waning fire and smiled at us all. But I think there was just a little hesitation in his smile. "If I begin," he said. "I wouldn't begin," said Wish. "It's all right," said Evans. "Matter is indestructible. You don't think any jiggery-pokery of this sort is going to snatch Clayton into the world of shades? Not it. You may try, Clayton, so far as I'm concerned, until your arms drop off at the wrists." "I don't believe that," said Wish, and stood up and put his arm on Clayton's shoulder. "You've made me half believe in that story somehow, and I don't want to see the thing done." "Goodness," said I. "Here's Wish, frightened." "I am," said Wish, with real or admirably feigned intensity. "I believe that if he goes through these motions right, he'll go." "He'll not do anything of the sort," I cried. "There's only one way out of this world for men, and Clayton is 30 years from that. Besides, and such a ghost, do you think—" Wish interrupted me by moving. He walked out from among our chairs and stopped beside the tole and stood there. "Clayton," he said, "you're a fool." Clayton, with a humorous light in his eyes, smiled back at him. "Wish," he said, "is right, and all you others are wrong. I shall go. I shall get to the end of these passes, and as the last swish whistles through the air, presto, this hearthrug will be vacant. The room will be blank amazement, and a respectably dressed gentleman of 15 stone will plump into the world of shades. I'm certain. So will you be. I decline to argue further. Let the thing be tried." "No," said Wish, and made a step and ceased, and Clayton raised his hands once more to repeat the spirit's passing. By that time, we were all in a state of tension, largely because of the behaviour of Wish. We sat, all of us, with our eyes on Clayton. I, at least, with a sort of tight, stiff feeling about me, as though from the back of my skull to the middle of my thighs, my body had been changed to steel. And there, and with a gravity that was imperturbably serene, Clayton bowed and swayed and waved his hands and arms before us. As he drew towards the end, one piled up. One tingled in one's teeth.
The last gesture, I have said, was to swing the arms out wide open, with the face held up. And when at last he swung out to this closing gesture, I ceased even to breathe. It was ridiculous, of course, but you know that ghost story feeling. It was after dinner, in a queer, old shadowy house. Would he, after all? There he stood, for one stupendous moment, with his arms open, and his upturned face assured and bright in the glare of the hanging lamp. We hung through that moment, as if it were an age, and then came from all of us something that was half a sigh of infinite relief and half a reassuring no. For visibly he wasn't going. It was all nonsense. He'd told an idle story and carried it almost to conviction. That was all. And then, in that moment, the face of Clayton changed. It changed. It changed as a lit house changes when its lights are suddenly extinguished. His eyes were suddenly eyes that were fixed. His smile was frozen on his lips. And he stood there still. He stood there very gently swaying. That moment, too, was an age. And then, chairs were scraping, things were falling, and we were all moving. His knees seemed to give, and he fell forward, and Evans rose and caught him in his arms. It stunned us all. For a minute, I suppose, no one said a coherent thing. We believed it, yet could not believe it. I came out of a muddled stupefaction to find myself kneeling beside him, and his vest and shirt were torn open, and Sanderson's hand lay on his heart. Well, the simple fact before us could very well wait our convenience. There was no hurry for us to comprehend. It lay there for an hour. It lies athwart my memory, black and amazing still to this day. Clayton had, indeed, passed into the world that lies so near to and so far from our own, and he had gone thither by the only road that mortal man may take. But whether he did indeed pass there by that poor ghost's incantation, nor whether he was stricken suddenly by apoplexy in the midst of an idle tale, as the coroner's jury would have us believe, is no matter for my judging. It's just one of those inexplicable riddles that must remain unsolved until the final solution of all things shall come. All I certainly know is that in the very moment, in the very instant of concluding those passes, he changed and staggered and fell down before us, dead. The end of the story of the Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells, read by Alan Lord. The Sullivan Looking-Glass by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alan Lord. The Sullivan Looking-Glass by Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Aunt Lois, said I, what was that story about Ruth Sullivan? Aunt Lois's quick black eyes gave a surprised flash, and she and my grandmother looked at each other a minute significantly. Who told you anything about Ruth Sullivan? She said sharply. Nobody. Somebody said you knew something about her, said I. I was holding a skein of yarn for Aunt Lois, and she went on winding in silence, putting the ball through loops and tangled places. Little boys shouldn't ask questions, she concluded at last, sententiously. Little boys that ask too many questions get sent to bed. I knew that of old, and rather wondered at my own hardihood. Aunt Lois wound on in silence, but looking in her face, I could see plainly that I had started an exciting topic. "I should think," pursued my grandmother in her corner, "that Ruth's case might show you, Lois, that a good many things may happen, more than you believe." "Oh, well, Mother, Ruth's was a strange case, but I suppose there are ways of accounting for it." "You believed Ruth, didn't you?" "Oh, certainly I believed Ruth. Why shouldn't I? Ruth was one of my best friends, and as true a girl as lives. There wasn't any nonsense about Ruth. She was one of the sort," said Aunt Lois reflectively, "that I'd as soon trust as myself. When she said a thing was so and so, I knew it was so." "Then if you think Ruth's story was true," pursued my grandmother, "what's the reason you are always cavilling at things just 'cause you can't understand how they came to be so?" Aunt Lois set her lips firmly and wound with grim resolve. She was the very impersonation of that obstinate rationalism that grew up at the New England fireside, close alongside of the most undoubting faith in the supernatural. "I don't believe such things," at last she snapped out, "and I don't disbelieve them. I just let 'em alone. What do I know about 'em? Ruth tells me a story, and I believe her. I know what she saw beforehand came true in a most remarkable way. Well, I'm sure I've no objection. One thing may be true, or another, for all me. But just because I believe Ruth Sullivan, I'm not going to believe right and left all the stories in Cotton either, and all that anybody can hark up to tell. Not I." This whole conversation made me all the more curious to get at the story thus dimly indicated, and so we beset Sam for information. "So your Aunt Lois wouldn't tell you nothing?" said Sam. "Want to know now? Sure?" "No. She said we must go to bed if we asked her." "That is a way folks has. But you see, boys," said Sam, while a droll, confidential expression crossed the lackluster dolefulness of his visage, "you see, I put you up to it, 'cause Miss Lois is so large and commanding in her ways, and so kind of up and down in all her doings, that I like once in a while to sort of gravel her. And I knowed enough to know that question would get her in a tight place. You see, your Aunt Lois was knowing to all this here about Ruth, so there were no getting away from it. And it's about as remarkable a providence as any of them of Mr. Cotton Mather's Magnilly. So if you'll come up in the barn chamber this afternoon, where I got a lot of flax to hatchel out, I'll tell you all about it." So that afternoon beheld Sam arranged at full length on a pile of top-toe in the barn chamber, hatcheling by proxy by putting Harry and myself to the service. "Well, now, boys, it's kind of refreshing to see how well you take hold," he observed. "Nothing like being industrious while you're young. Great sight better now than loafing off down in them meadows. In books and work and useful play, let my first years be past. So shall I give for every day some good account at last." "But Sam, if we work for you, you must tell us that story about Ruth Sullivan." "Lordy massy, yes, 'cause I will. I've had the best kind of chances of knowing all about that. Well, you see, there was old General Sullivan. He lived in state and grandeur in the old Sullivan house out to Roxbury. I been to Roxbury and seen that house at General Sullivan's. There was one time that I was a considerable spell looking round in Roxbury, and kind of seeing how things was there. and whether or no there mightn't be some sort of providential opening or something. I used to stay with Aunt Polly Ginger. She was sister to Mayhittable Ginger, General Sullivan's housekeeper, and had the in and out of the Sullivan house, and kind of kept the run of how things went and came in it. Polly, she was a kind of cousin of my mother's, and allers glad to see me. Fact was, I was pretty handy round house, and she used to save up her broken things and sich, till I come round in the fall, and then I'd man 'em up, and put the clock right, and split her up a lot of kindlings, and board up the cellar windows, and kind of make her sort of comfortable, and she being a lone body, and no man round. As I said, it was sort of convenient to have me, and so I just got the run of things in the Sullivan house pretty much as if I was one on 'em. General Sullivan, he kept a grand house, I tell you. You see, he come from the old country and felt sort of lordly and grand, and they used to have the greatest kind of doings there to the Sullivan house. You ought to seen that house. Great big front hall and great wide stairs. None of your steep kind that breaks a fella's neck to get up and down, but great broad stairs with easy rises. So they used to say you could have cantered a pony up that stairway easy as not. Then there was great wide rooms, and sofas, and curtains, and great curtained bedsteads that looked sort of like fortifications, and pictures that was got in Italy and Rome and all them heathen places. You see, the general was a dreadful worldly old critter, and was all for the pomps and the vanities. Lordy mercy, I wonder what the poor old critter thinks about it all now, when his body's all gone to dust and ashes in the graveyard, and his soul's gone to eternity. Well, that ain't none of my business, only it shows the vanity of riches in a kind of striking light, and makes me content that I never had none. But Sam, I hope General Sullivan wasn't a wicked man, was he? Well, I wouldn't say he was really wickeder than the run, but he was one of these here high-stepping, big-feeling fellas that seem to be having their portion in this life. Dreadful proud he was, and he was pretty much sot on this world, and kept a sort of court going on round him. Well, I don't judge him, nor nobody. Folks that has the world is apt to get sot on it. Don't none of us do more than middling well. But Sam, what about Ruth Sullivan? Ruth? Oh, yes, Ruth. Well, you see, the only crook in the old general's lot was he didn't have no children. Miss Sullivan, she was a beautiful woman, as handsome as a picture. But she never had but one child, and he was a son who died when he was a baby, and about broke her heart. And then this here Ruth was her sister's child, that was born about the same time, and when the boy died, they took Ruth home to sort of fill his place and kind of comfort up Miss Sullivan. And then Ruth's father and mother died, and they adopted her for their own and brought her up. Well, she grew up to be amazing handsome. Why, everybody said that she was just the light and glory of that old Sullivan place, and worth more'n all the pictures and the silver and the jewels and all there was in the house. And she was just so innocent and sweet that you never see nothing to beat it. Well, your Aunt Lois, she got acquainted with Ruth one summer when she was up to Old Town a-visiting a Parson Lothrop's. Your Aunt Lois was a gal then, and a pretty good-looking one, too, and somehow or other she took to Ruth, and Ruth took to her. And when Ruth went home, they used to be riding backwards and forwards. And I guess the fact was, Ruth thought about as much as your Aunt Lois as she did of anybody. You see, your aunt was a kind of strong, up and down woman that always knew certain just what she did know. And Ruth, she was one of them gals that seemed sort of like a stray lamb or a dove that's sort of lost their way in the world and wants someone to show 'em where to go next. For, you see, the fact was, the old general and madam, they didn't agree very well. He warn't well pleased that she didn't have no children, and she was sort of jealous of him, 'cause she got a hold of some sort of story about how he was to have married somebody else over there in England. So she got sort of riled up, just as women will, the best on 'em, and they was pretty apt to have spats, and one could give t'other as good as they sent, and by all accounts, they fit pretty lively sometimes. And between the two, Ruth, she was sort of scared and fluttered like a dove that didn't know just where to settle. You see, there she was in that great wide house, where they was a feasting and a prancing and a dancing and a going on like Ahasuerus and Herodias and all them old scripture days. There was a coming and going, and there was great dinners and great doings, but no love. And you know, the scripture says, better is a dinner of yarbs where love is than a stalled ox, and hatred therewith. Well, I don't ought to say hatred, after all. I kind of reckon the old general did the best he could. The fact is, when a woman gets a kink in her head agin a man, the best on us don't allers do just the right thing. Anyway, Ruth, she was sort of forlorn, and didn't seem to take no comfort in the goings-on. The general, he was mighty fond on her, and proud on her, and there wasn't nothing too good for Ruth. He was free-handed, the general was. He dressed her up in silks and satins, and she had a maid to wait on her, and she had the sets of pearl and diamond, and Madam Sullivan, and she thought all the world on her, and kind of worshipped the ground she trod on, and yet Ruth was sort of lonesome. You see, Ruth warn't calculated for grandeur. Some folks ain't. Why, that summer she spent out to Old Town, she was just as chirk and chipper as a wren, wearing her little sunbonnet and going a huckleberrying and a blackberrying and digging sweet flag and getting cowslips and dandelions. And she had a word for everybody, and everybody liked Ruth and wished her well. Well, she was sent for her health, and she got that, and more too. She got a sweetheart. You see, there was a Captain Oliver a-visiting at the minister's that summer, a nice, handsome young man as ever was. He and Ruth and your Aunt Lois, they was together a good deal, and they was a rambling and a riding and a sailing. And so Ruth and the captain went away all the earth, and fell dead in love with each other. Your Aunt Lois, she was knowing to it, and all about it, 'cause Ruth, she was just one of them that couldn't take a step without somebody to talk to. Captain Oliver was of a good family in England, and so when he made bold to ask the old general for Ruth, he didn't say him nay, and it was agreed, as they was young, they should wait a year or two. If he and she was of the same mind, he should be free to marry her. Just right on that, the captain's regiment was ordered home, and he had to go, and the next they heard, it was sent off to India, and poor little Ruth, she kind of drooped and pined. But she kept true. I wouldn't have nothing to say to nobody that came out of her, for there was lots and cords of fellers as did come out of her. You see, Ruth had a taking way with her, and then she had the name of being a great heiress, and that allers draws fellers as molasses does flies. Well, then the news came that Captain Oliver was coming home to England, and the ship was took by the Algerines, and he was gone into slavery, there among them heathen Mohammedans and what not. Folks seemed to think it was all over with him, and Ruth might just as well give up first as last. And the old general, he'd come to think she might do better, and he kept introducing one and another and trying to marry her off. But Ruth, she wouldn't. She used to write sheets and sheets to your Aunt Lois about it, and I think Aunt Lois, she kept her grit up. Your Aunt Lois, she'd have stuck by a man to the end of time if been her case, and so she told Ruth. Well, then there was young Jeff Sullivan, the general's nephew. He turned up, and the general, he took a great fancy to him. He was next heir to the general, but he had been a pretty rackety youngster in his young days, off to sea and what not, and sowed a considerable crop of wild oats. People said he'd been a pirating off there in South America. Lordy massy, nobody rightly knew where he had been or where he hadn't. All was, he turned up at last all alive and chipper as a skunk blackbird. Well, of course, he made his cart to Ruth, and the general, he rather backed him up in it. But Ruth, she wouldn't have nothing to say to him. Well, he come and took up his lodging at the general's, and he was just as slippery as an eel, and sort of slid into everything that was going on in the house and about it. He was here, and he was there, and he was everywhere, and having his say about this and that, and he got everybody pretty much under his thumb. And they used to say he wound the general round and round like a skein of yarn, but he couldn't come it round Ruth. Well, the general said she shouldn't be forced, and Jeff, he was smooth as satin, and said he'd be willing to wait as long as Jacob did for Rachel. And so there he sat down, a-watching, as patient as a cat at a mouse hole, 'cause the general, he was thick-set and short-necked and drank pretty free and was one of the sort that might pop off any time. Well, Miss Sullivan, she beset the general to make a provision for Ruth, 'cause she told him, very sensible, that he brought her up in luxury, and that it wasn't fair not to settle something on her. And so the general, he said he'd make a will and part the property equally between them. And he says to Jeff that if he played his part, as a young fella ought to know how, it would all come to him in the end. 'Cause they hadn't heard nothing from Captain Oliver for 3 or 4 years, and folks about settled it that he must be dead. Well, the general, he got a letter about an estate that had come to him in England, and he had to go over. Well, living on the next estate was the very cousin of the general's that he was to have married when they was both young. The lands joined so that the grounds run together. What came between them two, nobody knows, but she never married, and there she was. There was high words between the general and Madam Sullivan about his going over. She said there wasn't no sort of need on it, and he said there was, and she said she hoped she should be in her grave afore he come back, and he said she might suit herself about that for all him. That was the story that the housekeeper told to Aunt Polly, and Aunt Polly, she told me. These here squabbles somehow allers does kind of leak out one way or t'other. Anyhow, it was a house divided agin itself at the General's when he was a-fixing out for the voyage. There was Ruth, a-going first to one and then to t'other, and trying all she could to keep peace between 'em. And there was this here Master Slick-tongue talking this way to one side and that way to t'other, and the old General kind of like a shuttlecock atween 'em. Well, then the night afore he sailed, the General, he had his lawyer up in his library there, a-looking over all his papers and bonds and things, and a-witnessing his will. And Master Jeff was there, as lively as a cricket, a-going into all affairs and offering to take precious good care while he was gone. And the General, he had his papers and letters out, a-sorting on 'em over, which was to be took to the old country, and which was to be put in a trunk to go back to Lawyer Dennis's office. Well, Abner Ginger, Paula's boy, he that was footman and waiter then at the General's, he told me that about 8 o'clock that evening he went up with hot water and lemons and spirits and sich, and he see the great green table in the library all strewed and covered with piles of papers, and there was 10 boxes a-standing round, and the General a-packing the trunk, and the young Master Jeff as lively and helpful as a rat that smells cheese. And then the General, he says, "Abner," says he, "can you write your name?" "I should hope so, General," says Abner. "Well, then, Abner," says he, "this is my last will, and I want you to witness it." And so Abner, he put down his name opposite to a place with a wafer and a seal. And then the General, he says, "Abner, you tell Ginger to come here." That, you see, was his housekeeper, my Aunt Paula's sister, and a likely woman as ever was. And so they had her up, and she put down her name to the will. And then Aunt Polly, she was had up. She was drinking tea there that night, and she put down her name, and all of 'em did it with good heart, 'cause it had got about among 'em that the will was to provide for Miss Ruth. For everybody loved Ruth, you see, and there was considerable many stories kind of going the rounds about Master Jeff and his doings. And they did say he sort of kept up the strife between the General and my lady, and so they didn't think none too well of him. And as he was next of kin, and Miss Ruth wan't none of the General's blood, you see, she was Miss Sullivan's sister's child. Of course, there wasn't nothing go to Miss Ruth in way of law, and so that was why the signing of that our will was so much talked about among them. Well, you see, the General, he sailed the next day, and Jeff, he stayed by to keep watch of things. Well, the old General, he got over safe, for Miss Sullivan, she had a letter from him all right. When he got away, his conscience sort of nagged him, and he was minded to be a good husband. At any rate, he wrote a good, loving letter to her, and sent his love to Ruth, and sent over lots of little keepsakes and things for her, and told her that he left her under good protection, and wanted her to try and make up her mind to marry Jeff, as that would keep the property together. Well, now, there couldn't be no sort of sugar sweeter than Jeff was to them lone women. Jeff was one of the sort that could be all things to all women. He waited and he tended, and he was as humble as any snake in the grass that ever you see, and the old lady, she clean fell in with him. But Ruth, she seemed to have a regular spite agin him, and she that were as gentle as a lamb, that never had so much as a hard thought of a mortal critter, and wouldn't tread on a worm. She was so set agin Jeff that she wouldn't so much as touch his hand when she got out o' her carriage. Well, now comes the strange part of my story. Ruth was one of the kind that has the gift of seeing, and she was born with a veil over her face. This mysterious piece of psychological information about Ruth was given with a look and air that announced something very profound and awful, and we both took up the inquiry. Born with a veil over her face, how should that make her see? Well, boys, how should I know? But the fact is so. There's those as is well known as has the gift of seeing what others can't see. They can see through walls and houses, they can see people's hearts, they can see what's to come. They don't know nothing how 'tis, but this here knowledge comes to 'em. It's a great gift, and that sort's born with the veil over their faces. Ruth was all these here. Old Granny Badger, she was the knowingest old nurse in all these parts, and she was with Ruth's mother when she was born, and she told Lady Lothrop all about it. Says she, you may depend upon it, that child'll have the second sight, says she. Oh, that our fact was well known. Well, that was the reason why Jeff Sullivan couldn't come it round Ruth, though he was silkier than a milkweed pod, and just about as patient as a spider in his hole a-watching to get his grip on a fly. Ruth wouldn't argue with him, and she wouldn't flout him, but she just shut herself up in herself and kept a lookout on him. But she told your Aunt Lois just what she thought about him. Well, in about 6 months come the news that the General was dead. He dropped right down in his tracks, dead with apoplexy, as if he had been shot. And Lady Maxwell, she read a long letter to my lady and Ruth. You see, he got to be Sir Thomas Sullivan over there, and he was a-comin' home to take 'em all over to England to live in grandeur. Well, my Lady Sullivan, she was then, you see, she took it dreadful hard. If they'd have been the lovingest couple in the world, she couldn't have took it harder. And Polly, she said it was all 'cause she thought so much of him that she fit him so. There's women that think so much of their husbands that they won't let 'em have no piece of their life, and I expect it was so with her, poor soul. Anyway, she went right down smack when she heard he was dead. She was bad, sick, when the news come, and she never spoke nor smiled, just turned her back to everybody, and kinda wilted and was dead in a week. And there was poor little Ruth, left all alone in the world, with neither kith nor kin but Jeff. Well, when the funeral was over, and the time appointed to read the will and settle up matters, there wasn't no will to be found nowhere, high nor low. Lewendon, he flew round like a parched pea on a shovel. He said he thought he could have gone in the darkest night and put his hand on that 'ere will, but when he went where he thought it was, he found it wasn't there, and he knowed he'd kept it under lock and key. What he thought was the will turned out to be an old mortgage. Well, there was an awful row and a to-do about it, you may be sure. Ruth, she just said nothing, good or bad, and her not speaking made Jeff a sight more uncomfortable than if she'd have had it out with him. He told her it shouldn't make no sort of difference, that he should allers stand ready to give her all he had if she'd only take him with it. And when it came to that, she only gave him a look and went out of the room. Jeff, he fled and flounced and talked and went round and round a rumpussin among the papers. but no will was forthcoming, high or low. Well, now here comes what's remarkable. Ruth, she told this here, all the particulars, to your Aunt Lois and Lady Lothrop. She said that the night after the funeral, she went up to her chamber. Ruth had the great front chamber opposite to Miss Sullivan's. I've been in it. It was a monstrous big room with outlandish furniture in it that the general brought over from an old palace out to Italy. And there was a great big looking glass over the dressing table that they said come from Venice, that swung so that you could see the whole room in it. Well, she was a-standing front of this, just going to undress herself, a-hearing the rain drip on the leaves and the wind a-wishing and a-whispering in the old elm trees, and just a-thinking over her lot, and what should she do now, alone in the world, when of a sudden she felt a kind of lightness in her head, and she thought she seemed to see somebody in the glass a-moving, and she looked behind, and there wasn't nobody there. Then she looked forward in the glass and saw a strange big room that she'd never seen before, with a long painted window in it, and alongside of this stood a tall cabinet with a good many drawers in it, and she saw herself, and knew that it was herself in this room, along with another woman whose back was turned towards her. She saw herself speak to this woman and bend to the cabinet. She saw the woman nod her head. She saw herself go to the cabinet and open the middle drawer and take out a bundle of papers from the very back end on it. She saw her take out a paper from the middle and open it and hold it up, and she knew that there was the missing will. Well, it all overcame her so that she fainted clean away, and her maid found her a-lying front of the dressing table on the floor. She was sick of a fever for a week or fortnight at her, and your Aunt Lois, she was down taking care of her, and as soon as she got able to be moved, she was took out to Lady Lothrop's. Jeff, he was just as attentive and good as he could be, but she wouldn't bear him near her room. If he so much as set a foot on the stairs that led to it, she'd know it, and got so wild that he had to be kept from coming into the front of the house. But he was doing his best to buy up good words from everybody. He paid all the servants double. He kept everyone in their places, and did so well by 'em all that the general word among 'em was that Miss Ruth couldn't do better than to marry such a nice, open-handed gentleman. Well, Lady Lothrop, she wrote to Lady Maxwell all that had happened, and Lady Maxwell, she sent over for Ruth to come over and be a companion for her, and said she'd adopt her and be as a mother to her. Well, then Ruth, she went over with some gentlefolks that was going back to England, and offered to see her safe and sound, and so she was set down at Lady Maxwell's manor. It was a grand place, she said, and such as she never see before, like them old gentry places in England. And Lady Maxwell, she made much of her, and cosseted her up for the sake of what the old general had said about her. And Ruth, she told her all her story, and how she believed that the will was to be found somewhere, and that she should be led to see it yet. She told her, too, that she felt it in her that Captain Oliver wasn't dead, and that he'd come back yet. And Lady Maxwell, she took up for her with might and main, and said she'd stand by her. But then, you see, so long as there warn't no will to be found, there warn't nothing to be done. Jeff was the next heir, and he got everything, stock and lot and the estate in England into the bargain. and folks was beginning to think pretty well of him, as folks allers does when a body is up in the world and has houses and lands. Lordy massy, riches allers covers a multitude of sins. Finally, when Ruth had been 6 months with her, one day Lady Maxwell got to telling her all about her history and what had been between her and her cousin when they was young, and how they had a quarrel and he flung off to America, and all them things that it don't do folks no good to remember when it's all over and can't be helped. But she was a lone body, and it seemed to do her good to talk about it. Finally, she says to Ruth, says she, "I'll show you a room in this house you hain't seen before. It was the room where we had that quarrel," says she, "and the last I saw him was there till he come back to die," says she. So she took a great key out of her bunch, and she led Ruth along a long passageway to the other end of the house and opened on a great library. And the minute Ruth came in, she threw up her hands and gin a great cry. "Oh," says she, "this is the room, and there is the window, and there is the cabinet, and there in that middle drawer at the back end in a bundle of papers is the will." And Lady Maxwell, she said, quite dazed, "Go look," says she. And Ruth went, just as she seed herself do, and opened the drawer, and drew forth from the back part a yellow pile of old letters, and in the middle of those was the will, sure enough. Ruth drew it out, and opened it, and showed it to her. Well, you see, that will give Ruth the whole of the General's property in America, though it did leave the English estate to Jeff. Well, the end on it was like a storybook. Jeff, he made believe be mighty glad, and he said it must have been that the General had got flustered with the spirit and water and put that there will in among his letters that he was a-doing up to take back to England, for it was in among Lady Maxwell's letters that she writ him when they was young, and that he'd a-kept all these years and was a-taking back to her. Well, Lawyer Dean said he was sure that Jeff made himself quite busy and useful that night, by tying up the papers with red tape and a-packing the General's trunk, and that when Jeff gin him his bundle to lock up in his box, he never mistrusted but what he'd got it all right. Well, you see, it was just one of them things that can't be known to the Judgment Day. It might have been an accident, and then again it might not, and folks settled it one way or t'other, according to their opinion of Jeff. But you see how amazing handy for him it happened? Why, if it hadn't been for the providence I've been a-telling about, there it might have lain in them old letters that Lady Maxwell said she never had the heart to look over. They never would have turned up in the world. "Well," said I, "what became of Ruth?" "Oh, Captain Oliver, he came back all alive, and escaped from the Algerines, and they was married in King's Chapel, and lived in the old Sullivan house in peace and prosperity. That's just how the story was, and how Aunt Lois could make what she's a mind to out on it." "And what became of Jeff?" "Oh, he started to go over to England, and the ship was wrecked off the Irish coast, and that was the last of him. He never got to his property." "Good enough for him," said both of us. "Well, I don't know. 'Twas pretty hard on Jeff. Maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. I'm glad I wasn't in his shoes, though. I'd rather never had nothing. This here hasting to be rich, it's such a dreadful temptation. Well, now, boys, you've done a nice lot of flax, and I guess we'll go up to your grandfather's cellar and get a mug of cider. Talking always gets me dry.
End of The Sullivan Looking Glass. Read by Alan Lord.
There is a Reaper by Charles V. DeVette. Read for LibriVox.org by N.R. Collard. Doctors had given him just 1 month to live, a month to wonder what comes afterward. There was one way to find out. Ask a dead man. The amber brown of the liquor disguised the poison it held, and I watched with a smile on my lips as he drank it. There was no pity in my heart for him. He was a jackal in the jungle of life, and I was one of the carnivores. It is the lot of the jackals of life to be devoured by the carnivore. Suddenly, the contented look on his face froze into a startled stillness. I knew he was feeling the first savage twinge of the agony that was to come. He turned his head and looked at me, and I saw suddenly that he knew what I had done. "You murderer!" He cursed me, and then his body arched in the middle and his voice choked off deep in his throat. For a short minute he sat tense, his body stiffened by the agony that rode it, unable to move a muscle. I watched the torment in his eyes build up to a crescendo of pain, until the suffering became so great that it filmed his eyes, and I knew that, though he still stared directly at me, he no longer saw me. Then, as suddenly as the spasm had come, the starch went out of his body, and his back slid slowly down the chair edge. He landed heavily with his head resting limply against the seat of the chair. His right leg doubled up in a kind of jerk before he was still. I knew the time had come. "Where are you?" I asked. This moment had cost me $60,000. 3 weeks ago, the best doctors in the state had given me a month to live. And with $7 million in the bank, I couldn't buy a minute more. I accepted the doctor's decision philosophically, like the gambler that I am. But I had a plan, one which necessity had never forced me to use until now. Several years before, I had read an article about the medicine men of a certain tribe of aborigines living in the jungles at the source of the Amazon River. They had discovered a process in which the juice of a certain bush, known only to them, could be used to poison a man. Anyone subjected to this poison died, but for a few minutes after the life left his body, the medicine men could still converse with him. The subject, though ostensibly and actually dead, answered the medicine men's every question. This was their primitive, though reportedly effective method of catching glimpses of what lay in the world of death. I had conceived my idea at the time I read the article, but I had never had the need to use it until the doctors gave me a month to live. Then I spent my $60,000, and 3 weeks later I held in my hands a small bottle of the witch doctor's fluid. The next step was to secure my victim, my collaborator, I preferred to call him. The man I chose was a nobody, a homeless, friendless nonentity picked up off the street. He had once been an educated man, but now he was only a bum. And when he died, he'd never be missed. A perfect man for my experiment. I'm a rich man because I have a system. The system is simple. I never make a move until I know exactly where that move will lead me. My field of operation is the stock market. I spend money unstintingly to secure the information I need before I take each step. I hire the best investigators, bribe employees and persons in position, to give me the information I want, and only when I am as certain as humanly possible that I cannot be wrong do I move. And the system never fails. $7 million in the bank is proof of that. Now, knowing that I could not live, I intended to make the system work for me one last time before I died. I am a firm believer in the adage that any situation can be whipped, given prior knowledge of its coming, and of course its attendant circumstances. For a moment he did not answer, and I began to fear that my experiment had failed. "Where are you?" I repeated, louder and sharper this time. The small muscles about his eyes puckered with an unnormal tension, while the rest of his face held its death frost. Slowly, unnaturally, as though energized by some hyper-rational power, his lips and tongue moved. The words he spoke were clear. "I am in a tunnel," he said. "It is lighted, dimly, but there is nothing for me to see." Blue veins showed through the flesh of his cheeks, like watermarks on translucent paper. He paused, and I urged, "Go on." "I am alone," he said. "The realities I knew no longer exist. I am damp and cold. All about me is a sense of gloom and dejection. It is an apprehension, an emanation so deep and real as to be almost a tangible thing. The walls to either side of me seem to be formed, not of substance, but rather of the soundless cries of melancholy, of spirits I cannot see. I am waiting in the gloom for something which will come to me. That need to wait is an innate part of my being, and I have no thought of questioning it." His voice died again. "What are you waiting for?" I asked. "I do not know," he said, his voice dreary with the despair of centuries of hopelessness. "I only know that I must wait, that compulsion is greater than my strength to combat." The tone of his voice changed slightly. "The tunnel about me is widening, and now the walls have receded into invisibility. The tunnel has become a plain, but the plain is as desolate, as forlorn and dreary as was the tunnel, and still I stand and wait. How long must this go on?" He fell silent again, and I was about to prompt him with another question. I could not afford to let the time run out in long silences. But abruptly, the muscles about his eyes tightened, and subtly a new aspect replaced their hopeless dejection. Now they expressed a black, bottomless terror. For a moment I marvelled that so small a portion of a facial anatomy could express such horror. "There is something coming toward me," he said. "A beast, of brutish foulness. Beast is too inadequate a term to describe it, but I know no words to tell its form. It is an intangible and evasive thing, but very real. And it is coming closer. It has no organs of sight as I know them, but I feel it can see me. Or rather, that it is aware of me, with a sense sharper than vision itself. It is very near now. O God, the malevolence, the hate, the potentiality of awful, fearsome destructiveness, that is its very essence, and still I cannot move." The expression of terrified anticipation centred in his eyes, lessened slightly, and was replaced instantly by its former deep, deep despair. "I am no longer afraid," he said. "Why?" I interjected. "Why?" I was impatient to learn all that I could before the end came. "Because," he paused, "because it holds no threat for me. Somehow, some day I understand, I know, that it too is seeking that for which I wait." "What is it doing now?" I asked. "It has stopped beside me, and we stand together, gazing across the stark, empty plain. Now a second awful entity with the same leashed virulence about it moves up and stands at my other side. We all three wait, myself with a dark fear of this dismal universe, my unnatural companions with patient, malicious menace. Bits of, he faltered, of, I can name it only aura, go out from the beasts like an acid stream and touch me, and the hate and the venom chill my body like a wave of intense cold. Now there are others of this awful breed behind me. We stand, waiting, waiting, for that which will come. What it is I do not know. I could see the pallor of death creeping steadily into the last corners of his lips, and I knew that the end was not far away. Suddenly, a black frustration built up within me. "What are you waiting for?" I screamed, the tenseness and the importance of this moment forcing me to lose the iron self-control upon which I have always prided myself. I knew that the answer held the secret of what I must know. If I could learn that, my experiment would not be in vain, and I could make whatever preparations were necessary for my own death. I had to know that answer. "Think, think!" I pleaded. "What are you waiting for?" "I do not know." The dreary despair in his eyes, sightless as they met mine, chilled me with a coldness that I felt in the marrow of my being. "I do not know," he repeated. Yes, I do know." Abruptly, the plasmatic film cleared from his eyes, and I knew that for the first time since the poison struck, he was seeing me clearly. I sensed that this was the last moment before he left, for good. It had to be now. "Tell me, I command you," I cried. "What are you waiting for?" His voice was quiet as he murmured, softly, implacably, before he was gone. "We are waiting," he said, "for you." End of story. This recording is in the public domain.
The Trial for Murder by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neil Jaybe. I have always noticed a prevalent want of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to imparting their own psychological experiences when those have been of a strange sort. Almost all men are afraid that what they could relate in such wise would find no parallel or response in a listener's internal life, and might be suspected or laughed at. A truthful traveller, who should have seen some extraordinary creature in the likeness of a sea serpent, would have no fear of mentioning it. But the same traveller, having had some singular presentiment, impulse, vagary of thought, vision, so-called, dream, or other remarkable mental impression, would hesitate considerably before he would own to it. To this reticence I attribute much of the obscurity in which such subjects are involved. We do not habitually communicate our experiences of these subjective things as we do our experiences of objective creation. The consequence is that the general stock of experience in this regard appears exceptional, and really is so, in respect of being miserably imperfect. In what I am going to relate, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatever. I know the history of the bookseller of Berlin. I have studied the case of the wife of a late Astronomer Royal, as related by Sir David Brewster, and I have followed the minutest details of a much more remarkable case of spectral illusion, occurring within my private circle of friends. It may be necessary to state as to this last that the sufferer, a lady, was in no degree, however distant, related to me. A mistaken assumption on that head might suggest an explanation of a part of my own case, but only a part, which would be wholly without foundation. It cannot be referred to my inheritance of any developed peculiarity, nor had I ever before any at all similar experience, nor have I ever had any at all similar experience since. It does not signify how many years ago, or how few, a certain murder was committed in England, which attracted great attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in succession to their own atrocious eminence, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute, if I could, as his body was buried, in Newgate Jail. I purposely abstain from giving any direct clue to the criminal's individuality. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell, or I ought rather to say, for I cannot be too precise in my facts, it was nowhere publicly hinted that any suspicion fell, on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. As no reference was made at that time to him in the newspapers, it is obviously impossible that any description of him can at that time have been given in the newspapers. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper, containing the account of that first discovery, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention. I read it twice, if not 3 times. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and when I laid down the paper, I was aware of a flash, rush, flow, I do not know what to call it, no word I can find is satisfactorily descriptive, in which I seemed to see that bedroom passing through my room like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of relief, observed the absence of the dead body from the bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this curious sensation, but in chambers in Piccadilly, very near to the corner of St. James's Street. It was entirely new to me. I was in my easy-chair at the moment, and the sensation was accompanied with a peculiar shiver which started the chair from its position. But it is to be noted that the chair ran easily on casters. I went to one of the windows, there are 2 in the room, and the room is on the 2nd floor, to refresh my eyes with the moving objects down in Piccadilly. It was a bright autumn morning, and the street was sparkling and cheerful. The wind was high. As I looked out, it brought down from the park a quantity of fallen leaves, which a gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell and the leaves dispersed, I saw 2 men on the opposite side of the way, going from west to east. They were one behind the other. The foremost man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him, at a distance of some 30 paces, with his right hand menacingly raised. First, the singularity and steadiness of this threatening gesture in so public a thoroughfare attracted my attention, and next, the more remarkable circumstance that nobody heeded it. Both men threaded their way among the other passengers with a smoothness hardly consistent even with the action of walking on a pavement, and no single creature that I could see gave them place, touched them, or looked after them. In passing before my windows, they both stared up at me. I saw their 2 faces very distinctly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had consciously noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who went first had an unusually lowering appearance, and that the face of the man who followed him was of the colour of impure wax. I am a bachelor, and my valet and his wife constitute my whole establishment. My occupation is in a certain branch bank, and I wish that my duties as head of a department were as light as they are popularly supposed to be. They kept me in town that autumn, when I stood in need of change. I was not ill, but I was not well. My reader is to make the most that can be reasonably made of my feeling jaded, having a depressing sense upon me of a monotonous life, and being, quote, slightly dyspeptic. I am assured by my renowned doctor that my real state of health at that time justifies no stronger description, and I quote his own from his written answer to my request for it. As the circumstances of the murder gradually unravelling, took stronger and stronger possession of the public mind, I kept them away from mine by knowing as little about them as was possible in the midst of the universal excitement. But I knew that a verdict of wilful murder had been found against the suspected murderer, and that he had been committed to Newgate for trial. I also knew that his trial had been postponed over one sessions of the Central Criminal Court on the ground of general prejudice and want of time for the preparation of the defence. I may further have known, but I believe I did not, when or about when the sessions to which his trial stood postponed would come on. My sitting room, bedroom and dressing room are all on one floor. With the last there is no communication but through the bedroom. True, there is a door in it, once communicating with the staircase, but a part of the fitting of my bath has been, and had then been for some years, fixed across it. At the same period, and as part of the same arrangement, the door had been nailed up and canvassed over. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, giving some directions to my servant before he went to bed. My face was towards the only available door of communication with the dressing room, and it was closed. My servant's back was towards the door. While I was speaking to him, I saw it open, and a man look in, who very earnestly and mysteriously beckoned to me. That man was the man who had gone second of the two along Piccadilly, and whose face was the colour of impure wax. The figure, having beckoned, drew back and closed the door. With no longer pause than was made by my crossing the bedroom, I opened the dressing-room door and looked in. I had a lighted candle already in my hand. I felt no inward expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing-room, and I did not see it there. Conscious that my servant stood amazed, I turned round to him and said, "Derek, could you believe that in my cool senses I fancied I saw a—" As I there laid my hand upon his breast, with a sudden start he trembled violently, and said, "Oh Lord, yes, sir, a dead man beckoning." Now I do not believe that this John Derrick, my trusty and attached servant for more than 20 years, had any impression whatever of having seen any such figure, until I touched him. The change in him was so startling, when I touched him, that I fully believe he derived his impression in some occult manner from me at that instant. I bade John Derrick bring some brandy, and I gave him a dram, and was glad to take one myself. Of what had preceded that night's phenomenon, I told him not a single word. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen that face before, except on the one occasion in Piccadilly. Comparing its expression when beckoning at the door with its expression when it had stared up at me as I stood at my window, I came to the conclusion that on the first occasion it had sought to fasten itself upon my memory, and that on the second occasion it had made sure of being immediately remembered. I was not very comfortable that night, though I felt a certainty, difficult to explain, that the figure would not return. At daylight I fell into a heavy sleep, from which I was awakened by John Derrick's coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. This paper, it appeared, had been the subject of an altercation at the door between its bearer and my servant. It was a summons to me to serve upon a jury at the forthcoming sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. I had never before been summoned on such a jury, as John Derrick well knew. He believed, I am not certain at this hour whether with reason or otherwise, that that class of jurors were customarily chosen on a lower qualification than mine, and he had at first refused to accept the summons. The man who served it had taken the matter very coolly. He had said that my attendance or non-attendance was nothing to him. There the summons was, and I should deal with it at my own peril, and not at his. For a day or two I was undecided whether to respond to this call, or take no notice of it. I was not conscious of the slightest mysterious bias, influence, or attraction one way or other. Of that I am as strictly sure as of every other statement that I make here. Ultimately, I decided, as a break in the monotony of my life, that I would go. The appointed morning was a raw morning in the month of November. There was a dense brown fog in Piccadilly, and it became positively black, and in the last degree oppressive, east of Temple Bar. I found the passages and staircases of the courthouse flaringly lighted with gas, and the court itself similarly illuminated. I think that, until I was conducted by officers into the old court and saw its crowded state, I did not know that the murderer was to be tried that day. I think that, until I was so helped into the old court with considerable difficulty, I did not know into which of the two courts sitting my summons would take me. But this must not be received as a positive assertion, for I am not completely satisfied in my mind on either point. I took my seat in the place appropriated to jurors in waiting, and I looked about the court as well as I could through the cloud of fog and breath that was heavy in it. I noticed the black vapour hanging like a murky curtain outside the great windows, and I noticed the stifled sound of wheels on the straw or tan that was littered in the street. Also the hum of the people gathered there, which a shrill whistle or a louder song or hail than the rest occasionally pierced. Soon afterwards the judges, 2 in number, entered and took their seats. The buzz in the court was awfully hushed. The direction was given to put the murderer to the bar. He appeared there, and in that same instant I recognised in him the first of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt if I could have answered to it audibly. But it was called about 6th or 8th in the panel, and I was by that time able to say, "Here." Now, observe. As I stepped into the box, the prisoner, who had been looking on attentively, but with no sign of concern, became violently agitated, and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so manifest that it occasioned a pause, during which the attorney, with his hand upon the dock, whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first affrighted words to him were, "At all hazards, challenge that man." But that, as he would give no reason for it, and admitted that he had not even known my name until he heard it called and I appeared, it was not done. Both on the ground already explained, that I wished to avoid reviving the unwholesome memory of that murderer, and also because a detailed account of his long trial is by no means indispensable to my narrative, I shall confine myself closely to such incidents in the 10 days and nights during which we, the jury, were kept together, as directly bear on my own curious personal experience. It is in that, and not in the murderer, that I seek to interest my reader. It is to that, and not to a page of the Newgate Calendar, that I beg attention. I was chosen foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours, I heard the church clock strike, happening to cast my eyes over my brother jurymen, I found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same difficulty. In short, I made them one too many. I touched the brother juryman, whose place was next to me, and I whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted. "Why," says he, suddenly, "we are but no, it's not possible. No, we are 12. According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in the gross we were always one too many. There was no appearance, no figure to account for it, but I now had an inward foreshadowing of the figure that was surely coming. The jury were housed at the London Tavern. We all slept in one large room on separate tables, and we were constantly in the charge and under the eye of the officer sworn to hold us in safekeeping. I see no reason for suppressing the real name of that officer. He was intelligent, highly polite and obliging, and, I was glad to hear, much respected in the city. He had an agreeable presence, good eyes, enviable black whiskers, and a fine sonorous voice. His name was Mr. Harker. When we turned into our 12 beds at night, Mr. Harker's bed was drawn across the door. On the night of the second day, not being disposed to lie down and seeing Mr. Harker sitting on his bed, I went and sat beside him and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said, "Who is this?" Following Mr. Harker's eyes and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I expected, the second of the two men who had gone down Piccadilly. I rose and advanced a few steps, then stopped and looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way, "Ha! I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed, but I see it is the moonlight." Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, but inviting him to take a walk with me to the end of the room, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen, close to the pillow. It always went to the right-hand side of the bed, and always passed out crossing the foot of the next bed. It seemed, from the action of the head, merely to look down pensively at each recumbent figure. It took no notice of me, or of my bed, which was that nearest to Mr. Harker's. It seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window, as by an aerial flight of stairs. Next morning at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamed of the murdered man last night, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt as convinced that the second man who had gone down Piccadilly was the murdered man, so to speak, as if it had been borne into my comprehension by his immediate testimony. But even this took place, and in a manner for which I was not at all prepared. On the 5th day of the trial, when the case for the prosecution was drawing to a close, a miniature of the murdered man, missing from his bedroom upon the discovery of the deed, and afterwards found in a hiding place where the murderer had been digging, was put in evidence. Having been identified by the witness under examination, it was handed up to the bench, and thence handed down to be inspected by the jury. As an officer in a black gown was making his way with it across to me, the figure of the second man who had gone down Piccadilly impetuously started from the crowd, caught the miniature from the officer, and gave it to me with his own hands, at the same time saying, in a low and hollow tone, before I saw the miniature, which was in a locket, "I was younger then, and my face was not then drained of blood." It also came between me and the brother juryman to whom I would have given the miniature, and between him and the brother juryman to whom he would have given it, and so passed it on through the whole of our number and back into my possession. Not one of them, however, detected this. At table, and generally when we were shut up together in Mr. Harker's custody, we had from the first naturally discussed the day's proceedings a good deal. On that 5th day, the case for the prosecution being closed, and we having that side of the question in a completed shape before us, our discussion was more animated and serious. Among our number was a vestryman, the densest idiot I have ever seen at large, who met the plainest evidence with the most preposterous objections, and who was sided with by 2 flabby parochial parasites, all the 3 impanelled from a district so delivered over to fever that they ought to have been upon their own trial for 500 murders. When these mischievous blockheads were at their loudest, which was towards midnight, while some of us were already preparing for bed, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly behind them, beckoning to me. On my going towards them and striking into the conversation, he immediately retired. This was the beginning of a separate series of appearances, confined to that long room in which we were confined. Whenever a knot of my brother jurymen laid their heads together, I saw the head of the murdered man among theirs. Whenever their comparison of notes was going against him, he would solemnly and irresistibly beckon to me. It will be borne in mind that down to the production of the miniature on the 5th day of the trial, I had never seen the appearance in court. 3 changes occurred now that we entered on the case for the defence. 2 of them I will mention together first. The figure was now in court continually, and it never there addressed itself to me, but always to the person who was speaking at the time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across. In the opening speech for the defence, it was suggested that the deceased might have cut his own throat. At that very moment, the figure, with its throat in the dreadful condition referred to, this it had concealed before, stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across and across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously suggesting to the speaker himself the impossibility of such a wound having been self-inflicted by either hand. For another instance, a witness to character, a woman, deposed to the prisoner's being the most amiable of mankind. The figure at that instant stood on the floor before her, looking her full in the face and pointing out the prisoner's evil countenance with an extended arm and an outstretched finger. The third change now to be added impressed me strongly as the most marked and striking of all. I do not theorize upon it. I accurately state it, and there leave it. Although the appearance was not itself perceived by those whom it addressed, its coming close to such persons was invariably attended by some trepidation or disturbance on their part. It seemed to me as if it were prevented, by laws to which I was not amenable, from fully revealing itself to others, and yet as if it could invisibly, dumbly, and darkly overshadow their minds. When the leading counsel for the defence suggested that hypothesis of suicide, and the figure stood at the learned gentleman's elbow, frightfully sawing at its severed throat, it is undeniable that the counsel faltered in his speech, lost for a few seconds the thread of his ingenious discourse, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and turned extremely pale. When the witness to character was confronted by the appearance, her eyes most certainly did follow the direction of its pointed finger, and rest in great hesitation and trouble upon the prisoner's face. 2 additional illustrations will suffice. On the 8th day of the trial, after the pause which was every day made early in the afternoon for a few minutes' rest and refreshment, I came back into court with the rest of the jury some little time before the return of the judges. Standing up in the box and looking about me, I thought the figure was not there until, chancing to raise my eyes to the gallery, I saw it bending forward and leaning over a very decent woman, as if to assure itself whether the judges had resumed their seats or not. Immediately afterwards that woman screamed, fainted, and was carried out. So with the venerable, sagacious, and patient judge who conducted the trial. When the case was over and he settled himself in his papers to sum up, the murdered man, entering by the judge's door, advanced to his lordship's desk and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes, which he was turning. A change came over his lordship's face. His hand stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered.
"Excuse me, gentlemen, for a few moments. I am somewhat oppressed by the vitiated air,"
and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. Through all the monotony of 6 of those interminable 10 days, the same judges and others on the bench, the same murderer in the dock, the same lawyers at the table, the same tones of question and answer rising to the roof of the court, the same scratching of the judge's pen, the same ushers going in and out, the same lights kindled at the same hour when there had been any natural light of day, the same foggy curtain outside the great windows when it was foggy, the same rain pattering and dripping when it was rainy, the same footmarks of turnkeys and prisoner day after day on the same sawdust, the same keys locking and unlocking the same heavy doors. Through all the wearisome monotony which made me feel as if I had been foreman of the jury for a vast period of time, and Piccadilly had flourished coevally with Babylon, the murdered man never lost one trace of his distinctness in my eyes, nor was he at any moment less distinct than anybody else. I must not omit, as a matter of fact, that I never once saw the appearance, which I call by the name of the murdered man, look at the murderer. Again and again I wondered, why does he not? But he never did. Nor did he look at me, after the production of the miniature, until the last closing minutes of the trial arrived. We retired to consider at 7 minutes before 10 at night. The idiotic vestryman and his 2 parochial parasites gave us so much trouble that we twice returned into court to beg to have certain extracts from the judge's notes re-read. 9 of us had not the smallest doubt about these passages, neither, I believe, had any one in the court. The dunder-headed triumvirate, having no idea but obstruction, disputed them for that very reason. At length we prevailed, and finally the jury returned into court at 10 minutes past 12. The murdered man at that time stood directly opposite the jury box on the other side of the court. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me with great attention. He seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great grey veil, which he carried on his arm for the first time, over his head and whole form. As I gave in our verdict, guilty, the veil collapsed, all was gone, and his place was empty. The murderer, being asked by the judge, according to usage, whether he had anything to say before sentence of death should be passed upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers of the following day as, quote, a few rambling, incoherent, and half-audible words, in which he was understood to complain that he had not had a fair trial, because the foreman of the jury was prepossessed against him. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this: My lord, I knew I was a doomed man when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off, because before I was taken, he somehow got to my bedside in the night, woke me, and put a rope around my neck. End of the trial for murder.